Welcome. We're glad that you've joined us today for this webinar on the draft climate change mitigation criteria for the EPEAT Ecolabel. I'm Patty Dillon, Senior Director of Criteria and Category Development at the Global Electronics Council. Last week, GEC released its draft criteria on climate change mitigation for public comment. On today's webinar, we're really excited to share with you an overview of the draft criteria and the rationale behind the criteria. We'll also give you a quick tutorial on how to submit comments and answer any questions that you have. But first, a few quick housekeeping items. The webinar is being recorded. The recording will be made available following the call, and we encourage you to share it with your colleagues. Everyone is also on mute today to reduce background noise. If you have questions, we encourage you to type them into the questions window in the dashboard. We'll hold questions to the end of the presentations because we might be covering some of those topics that come up in your head. And we also, if we don't respond to your questions during the webinar, we will follow up with email afterwards. Next slide, please. So joining me on today's call are Erica Logan. Erica is Senior Manager for Technology Assessment and Resource Development on the Criteria Development Team at GEC. She's the project lead for developing criteria for our sustainability impact modules, beginning with this climate change mitigation module. I'm really excited to have Erica on our team as she brings decades of experience working in industry on environmental, health, safety, and sustainability topics. We're also pleased to have on today's webinar NSF International, who's GEC's partner in developing criteria for the sustainability impact modules. Jessica Evans is the Director of Standards Development at NSF International. She oversees all of NSF standards development efforts. Great expertise there. Jessica and her team facilitate the development and maintenance of more than 80 NSF ANSI standards, as well as over 70 protocols in the areas of food, water, sustainability, and health services. Greta Barriger, also on the call today, is the Sustainability Standards Lead at NFS. That is working with GEC directly to develop our sustainability criteria. Prior to joining NSF, Greta worked as a sustainability analyst at Steelcase, where she gained extensive experience supporting the company's sustainability objectives. Next slide, please. So with that, what will we cover on today's call? First, we're going to give you a quick overview of GEC's criteria development process because it's a new process in which we're developing criteria for the EPEAT program. We'll then, I'll move to Erica, who will give us some overview of the climate change mitigation state of sustainability research. She'll also go into an overview of the criteria, the climate change mitigation draft criteria. Then we'll turn it over to NSF and they'll talk about how to participate in the public comment process. We'll go through a little next steps. What do you do after the webinar? And finally, open it up to Q&A. Next slide, please. So let us begin with an overview of GEC's new criteria development process, which we're now using to develop criteria for the EPEAT program, starting with this climate change mitigation criteria. So next slide, please. These are the three key components in the GEC criteria development process. The process starts with state of sustainability research, which lays out the science and evidence to support criteria development. The research looks at sustainability impacts across the life cycle of products, as well as strategies and best practices to mitigate the identified impacts, which ultimately lead to recommendations for criteria. The second phase of the process is developing the criteria themselves. GEC, we're committed to developing criteria through voluntary consensus processes where we engage stakeholders in several ways, and I'll break that down in a minute on another slide. In developing the criteria, the focus is on addressing the priority impacts in the product life cycle as identified in the first step, the state of sustainability research. We want to focus our resources and those of our stakeholders on what matters. Basically, let's make a difference when we put forward some criteria. Let's make a sustainability difference. What's also new at GEC is developing criteria by sustainability impact modules, such as this first module on climate change mitigation. That's instead of developing criteria by product category. The module criteria will be applied across EPEAT product categories as appropriate, which will eliminate redundancy in criteria development and allow GEC, very importantly, to engage a broader range of stakeholders and experts in a more focused, streamlined process. In developing criteria, we do continue to provide flexibility through optional criteria and promote innovation. The final step in our process is continuous maintenance. Now, of course, that's after the criteria have been implemented within the EPEAT program, where we basically monitor and update criteria to reflect available science and market innovation, leadership, etc. Next slide, please. So here's a quick snapshot of the 4 sustainability impact modules that we are developing that will be applied across all EPEAT categories. In green is the climate change mitigation module, which is of course the focus of today's webinar. So I won't go into any detail on that. Other modules going clockwise are sustainable use of resources or circularity, and that's going to cover issues such as recycled content, designing for reuse, recycling, end-of-life management, product longevity, repairability, critical minerals, etc. The next, corporate environmental, social, and governance performance, will look at issues such as labor, worker health and safety, responsible mineral sourcing, and corporate reporting. And finally, we have reduction of chemicals of concern, looking at substance restrictions, inventory, manufacture process chemicals, etc. And importantly, each of these modules is a separate criteria development process. So let's look at that. Next step, how are we actually developing criteria in the modules? So as noted earlier, we begin the process with state of sustainability research. The climate change mitigation research went out for public comment in the spring of this year. And the final version, which is actually shown there on the left-hand side of the screen, we're very proud of this state of sustainability research. It's available now on the GEC website, and we'll provide, or Erica will provide, some highlights from the research later in this webinar. Now, based on the state of sustainability research, we enter criteria drafting stage. Draft criteria may originate from different sources, depending on the availability. For example, we will start with existing EPEAT criteria, if available, and they represent leadership. And that might be criteria as is, or perhaps with some modifications. GEC staff or partner organizations may also draft some criteria. We welcome submissions from stakeholders based on the state of sustainability research. If there's a criteria that a stakeholder wants to submit, we welcome it. In fact, for the climate change mitigation module, one of the criteria or topics was proposed and submitted by a manufacturer stakeholder. Then these criteria, the draft criteria, then go to expert ad hoc groups. GEC puts out a call for participation and forms these expert ad hoc groups. The expert ad hoc groups for climate change actually met from June through mid-September. Right now, we're forming expert ad hoc groups for sustainable use of resources, if you're interested in that. And the expert ad hoc groups, they provide technical feedback on the draft criteria. And in some cases, they actually will draft criteria as well. If there's additional criteria that are identified, they can draft criteria. For climate change mitigation, we had 6 expert ad hoc groups working on the different criteria topics. And these topics align with the sections of the criteria document. So after the draft criteria are developed and seem to be in good shape, they're then compiled into what we call a full draft criteria document. This is delivered to the technical committee and made available for public consultation. That's where we are in the process right now for climate change mitigation. You can actually see in the middle bottom of your screen the first GEC criteria document for climate change mitigation that is available for review. And then finally, the resulting, the draft criteria document, it goes to a technical committee, which is the consensus body. That group deliberates on the criteria. They consider the public comments. There's a 60-day public comment process that we're in right now for the climate change mitigation criteria, which of course is why we're holding this webinar today. They will modify criteria as needed based on their deliberations and the public comments, and they ultimately approve the criteria by consensus. The resulting criteria are ultimately implemented in the EPEAT program. So that's a snapshot of the process. Next slide, please. So here, we wanted to give a high-level view of the principles for GEC criteria for the EPEAT program. These are available in our policies and procedures, but these are also the principles that we ask the technical committee to consider, and we ask you as public commenters to consider as you're reviewing and commenting on criteria. There's 6 principles. The first is that criteria address the priority sustainability impacts that have been identified in the state of sustainability research. And that is impacts throughout the life cycle of the product, inclusive of the supply chain. The second principle for criteria for EPEAT are that they establish a baseline leadership performance, meaning that we specify criteria that are required to be met in order to be EPEAT, while using optional criteria to incentivize continuous improvement and innovation. The third is that criteria represent leadership and current best practices for reducing the identified impacts. Of course, we consider life cycle trade-offs and the ability of the market to meet the criteria within a reasonable time frame. And in a minute, I'm going to share with you the time frame for implementing the modular criteria, so you can keep that in mind when you're reviewing the criteria. Criteria, fourth, should differentiate environmental and socially preferable products, sustainable products, from others in the marketplace based on measurable differences in impact. Now, we of course acknowledge that you cannot always quantify the outcome, but we do want to be able to differentiate products in the marketplace. Fifth, criterion should align with international leadership best practices. It could be regulations, standard, voluntary programs, and of course we can't create obstacles to international trade. And finally, the sixth principle is that criteria should be able to be independently verified through objective measures and commonly accepted tools, methodologies, or standards. So in each of the criteria, you'll actually see verification requirements. How will we actually objectively measure whether a criterion is being met? So next and final slide for me is the implementation timeline. We are implementing the modules in EPEAT in 2 phases. First phase is the simultaneous rollout of the 4 impact modules that I showed you before across EPEAT product categories that launched prior to 2020. That would include computers and displays, imaging equipment, mobile phones, servers, and televisions. The categories that were launched in or after 2022 are not actually ready for criteria revisions according to our policies. They're not in that the revision, evaluation and revision of the criteria. So those categories, which include photovoltaics and inverters, network equipment, and wearables, will not have the full suite of module criteria applied to them until 2024. With one exception, though, we are developing a wearables category right now, health and well-being wearable devices, and we will be applying the climate change criteria to that product category because the criteria are applicable and we don't want to duplicate effort. So then if you look at the graph below, just sort of, let's put this in a timeline. We anticipate completion of the modules by the end of 2020. EPEAT will then build out the registry, which we expect to be complete after about 4 months because the registry will be starting to be built out as the modules are developed. We anticipate launching the public registry, the public-facing registry for the new criteria in May of 2023. And manufacturers will then have 12-month transition period until April of 2024. These are approximate dates. But at that point, at the end of this 12-month transition, the transition period is when the old and the new registries are available and available to the public. But then at the end of the 12-month transition period, the old registry with the existing criteria will sunset or end, be taken down, and then all products must meet the new modular criteria in order to carry the EPEAT eco-label. So this is just something to keep in mind as you're reviewing the criteria, that manufacturers will have 2 to 2.5 years to implement the sustainability impact modules. So next slide, please. And I will now turn it over to Erica Logan, who will dive into the climate change research and criteria. Erica?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Patty. Great introduction here. And thanks to our participants for being with us today. So let me share with you a few highlights of our state of sustainability research. Next slide, please. So at a very high level here, we have a PhD candidate fellow on staff who did a nice job of reviewing publicly available literature and data sources. She considered the full life cycle of electronic products from raw material extraction to end of life and focused on the ICT products for which we currently have EPEAT registered products, which you'll see here on the right: computers and displays, imaging equipment, mobile phones, network equipment, servers, and televisions. And I would say, you know, there's a lot of great information in that report. I encourage you to read it. But a key takeaway, really key point, is that upstream or embodied carbon and operational product use carbon emissions are the most significant contributors to life cycle GHG emissions. With the relative percentage dependent on, I would summarize it as whether the product type has a battery or a plug, and I'll say more about that on the next slide. And just to kind of reiterate this point a little further, you know, with respect to embodied carbon, which is essentially the emissions associated with each stage of the life cycle with the exception of product use, once again, upstream production, which includes the raw material extraction, the material and component manufacturing, and product assembly and transport, are the most significant contributors. So keep this in mind as we work through the proposed criteria. Next slide, please. So a little bit more on the relative contributions of embodied versus operational carbon. I like this graphic. I think it does a nice job of illustrating. If you work from the bottom up, and so for example, if you look at a large chassis router, a rack server, a blade system, the gray is use phase. And you can see that it's a very large proportion of the overall contribution. If you work your way up a little further and look at a more portable mobile product, such as a laptop, a notebook, an iPad, or a tablet rather, you'll see The blue is the production phase, and it constitutes a much larger overall percentage of the carbon footprint of a given product. So once again, you know, the plug, whether it's plugged into an AC outlet the majority of the time, or if it's a mobile device that's charged with a battery. But once again, kind of the key message here being that you know, upstream and use phase are significant contributors. Next slide, please. Diving down a little bit further. So as we look a little more closely, a little more granularly at the upstream carbon emissions, this study did a nice job of illustrating priority component parts. And you'll see the pink, the hatched pink and white, you know, is the relative contribution of the printed circuit board, the integrated circuits. If the product has a display, the yellow, the display is a significant proportion as well as power supplies. And so you'll see this data reflected in our criteria as well. Next slide, please. And so how did the research inform our mitigation strategies and hence our criteria development? And so to summarize, you'll see kind of three key pillars here. One of reducing upstream embodied carbon, reducing use phase energy consumption, and then assessment and transparency, the tools to measure that and to set goals to reduce emissions. And so working from the top relative to upstream embodied carbon, one key strategy you'll see reflected in the criteria is to reduce the use of carbon intensive energy sources in component and manufacturing facilities via the sourcing of renewable electricity. You'll see another key strategy is to reduce upstream energy consumption in manufacturing through implementation of energy management systems. You'll also see an emphasis on continued emphasis on reducing emissions from fluorinated greenhouse gases because of the potent global warming potential. Relative to use phase, you'll see a continued emphasis on leveraging the essential elements of Energy Star as an internationally recognized best practice. And then lastly, related to assessment and transparency, this is about, you know, doing the carbon footprint to identify the hotspots and then setting goals aligned with the latest climate science. Next slide, please. So let's dive into the criteria. Next slide. So this slide's a bit of an eye chart, but my point here is just to give you first kind of the big picture of what's being proposed. You will see there are 19 criteria divided up into 6 different buckets. First and foremost, I really want to thank the efforts of the expert ad hocs. We had 6 different groups working on these different sets of criteria. They really lent a lot of time, energy, and expertise to this process, and thank you for that. Some other things I wanted to point out is, especially for those of you who are familiar with EPEAT and have been working on EPEAT criteria for a number of years, you're going to see a lot more required criteria than we've had in the past. And as Patty mentioned in the introduction, required criteria are required for a product to even get on the EPEAT registry to be considered bronze. So it sets a minimum baseline leadership performance level. The required criteria are intended to move the market by incentivizing. You'll see a lot of emphasis on greater coverage of the supply chain. Just double checking my notes here. Yeah, so those are some of the key points I wanted to make here. So now let's dive into each one of these and let me share with you a few highlights of what each category covers here. Next slide, please. So beginning with kind of the foundation here of doing carbon footprint analysis to identify hotspots and inform mitigation strategies, you'll see a proposal for a required criterion to do a product carbon footprint. This will apply to every registered product. And then you'll see continued optional criteria for corporate carbon footprint, product transport, which provides a little more granularity. And then there's always the option of doing a full LCA as opposed to a focus specifically on carbon emissions. Relative to the corporate carbon footprint, wanted to mention that we had some discussion about dropping this criterion, that it's become a pretty prevalent practice in the electronics industry. But then we had an equal amount of discussion about the fact that this is proposed to be inclusive of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And you can see from the diagram at the below that scope 3 encompasses the supply chain, that this is still quite challenging to do, and that it is definitely not a common practice beyond the electronics industry. And there's an opportunity here for us to demonstrate leadership and to really be a role model for other industries as well. And so the recommendation to our technical committee is to continue to have a corporate carbon footprint criterion. Next slide, please. It looks like my graphics are covering the bottom of my screen here a little bit, but anyway, what this set of criteria is about setting carbon reduction goals aligned with the latest climate science. And we're proposing a required manufacturer greenhouse gas reduction goal that would be endorsed by the Science Based Targets Initiative. SBTI is developed via a partnership between CDP, the United Nations Global Compact, WRI, and WWF. It really has become the gold standard internationally for setting climate-aligned goals. Then we have a proposal for an optional, a stretch goal that is adds another level of ambition by driving towards a net zero goal as soon as possible, but by mid-century at the latest. And then a third potential optional goal is around encouraging suppliers to set their own SBTI aligned emission reduction goals, at least for scopes 1 and 2. Wanted to point out that this was one area where GEC via the expert ad hoc found that there were two very technically sound approaches and paths to this. And so this is something our technical committee will be deliberating, and we welcome your comments through the public comment period. As to whether or not 4.2.3 should be included or not. Some would say that the 4.2.1 encompasses supply chain considerations as well, and that 4.2.3 is a slightly more prescriptive way of achieving the same goals and objectives, but that there are other ways that this can be achieved. And then others would say that it's an extremely valuable incentive as they try to motivate their supply chain. So I wanted to point this out because we definitely welcome your comments through the public comment period. Next slide, please. So manufacturing energy efficiency. Want to point out a significant change here from what you've seen in the past, in that we're proposing a required criterion for implementation of ISO 50001, or an energy management system for final assembly facilities, as well as an expectation to cascade that same requirement deeper into the supply chain. And the idea here being that manufacturers, the brands, have the highest degree of influence with their tier 1, with their directly contracted suppliers. And so it leverages those relationships and that influence, but at the same time, it works to drive that expectation further into the supply chain, where the carbon emissions are the most significant, as you saw from the graphs I showed earlier, and the priority component parts. So this one is proposed to be required. Then we continue to have optional criteria for extending that effort further into the supply chain and then verifying that it's actually been achieved. We also have a proposed optional criterion for demonstrated energy performance improvement. And so theoretically, and the data supports that if you go to the time, money, and effort to implement ISO 50001, you're likely going to see improvements of at least 4 to 5% in your energy performance on a yearly basis. However, there are other ways to achieve that. And if you can demonstrate that through other programs such as Energy Star, buildings management, of course, the bottom line objective is to reduce energy consumption. And so we want to award credit for that as well. And then lastly, you'll notice there is a data reporting kind of criterion, which is aimed at increasing transparency and reporting while also being sensitive to confidential business information concerns by allowing this in some fashion in an aggregate way, which will lay the data framework that's needed really over time for manufacturers to decarbonize their supply chain. So really excited about this set of criteria. Next slide, please. Equally excited about renewable electricity sourcing and procurement. In terms of the impacts we can have on reducing carbon emissions, I don't know if there's anything more important than transforming our grid. And the proposal here is to have a required criterion for manufacturers, and I know this is a significant change, and we welcome your comments during the public comment period. So at a lower threshold for 25% of renewable electricity sourcing needs, that it be from renewable sources. Focus this one on manufacturers' operations, where manufacturers have the highest degree of control. However, still maintaining optional criteria to incentivize further action to 50% or 95% of renewable electricity sourcing. And then thirdly, and super, super important, is the supplier renewable electricity generation and procurement criterion. And you will notice that the proposal is to award up to 4 points for this, which shows how much weight and significance we're placing on this. And the number of points increases as you implement this in a greater percentage of the supply chain, and as that percentage of the supply chain sources a greater percentage from renewable electricity sources. So very exciting. Next slide, please. To address high global warming potential chemicals used in manufacturing, so moving up the supply chain, we had some terrific experts work on this criterion and evaluate currently available existing sources of data, and as well as the criteria currently included in the IEEE 1680.1 standard. And after a lot of analysis work and effort, in part because of intellectual property restrictions, our recommendation to the technical committee is that we directly reference the IEEE 1680 criteria. At this point, I mean, we'll certainly reevaluate this approach through the continuous maintenance process, but at this point in time, we feel like this is the most expedient way most effective way for addressing this impact. And just also wanted to point out that as you're working on your comments, if you would like to reference the IEEE criteria, there is an agreement between IEEE and GEC that allows for access. And we're happy to provide you with this web link. Next slide, please. And finally, so product energy efficiency. You will see that we're proposing to maintain the required dynamic link to Energy Star. also proposing required criteria for external power supplies and battery chargers. And yes, the EPS and the battery charger system criteria are based on regulatory requirements in parts of the world, North America, and then in the case of EPS is the EU. We believe that this still provides leadership globally, that we don't have similar requirements yet in Asia and in Latin America. And so similar to the way we leverage the EU's ROS directive, it's a regulatory requirement for Europe, but not for the rest of the world. And we leverage that globally. We believe that this too, similarly, can move the market globally. Next slide. I think that is, yes, that is my section. Thank you so much for your time. And I will transition to NSF.
Great, thank you so much, Erica. Before I turn it over to Jessica Evans and Greta at NSF, we did get one comment in that I thought to address right this minute. There was a question about, Erica gave some great background on the criteria and where we might be looking for some specific input. And so there was a question that came in, is there a document or summary that we can refer to on the criteria that GEC is especially looking for feedback on, such as the 423 on the science-based targets for suppliers, and some of the discussion that occurred around these points to help inform public comment. So GEC did prepare a summary document for the technical committee with this background, and we will actually, at this point, we just have to see if it's appropriate for public distribution. There is the identity of people in there. We might have to just scrub that, but we'll actually look into making that available, because I do think that that could be useful for folks that are reviewing and submitting comments. So thank you for that question.
New information. Thank you, Patty.
Yeah, so now let's turn it over to NSF. First, Jess Evans, the NSF's Director of Standards Development, and Greta, who will talk about the public comment process. Jess and Greta.
Great, thank you so much, Patty. Hello, everyone. I am going to provide some high-level overview items on the public comment process, and then Greta will provide a little bit more detailed instructions on how to submit those comments for consideration. So the public comment component of our process is essential in incorporating all of the feedback from interested parties who are directly and materially affected by the criteria. And this supports our openness and transparency of the criteria development process. As Patty mentioned, the 60-day public comment period launched on October 6th and will run for 60 days and close on December 6th. It runs, the comment period runs concurrently with the technical committee balloting period, and the comments that are collected from both of those components will be integrated into our future meetings with the technical committee and will be discussed at great length within that group. Once we've addressed all of the comments and considered those, there will be a final summary that is uploaded and made available to all the interested parties. And it will include the comments themselves and then the actions that are taken to address those comments. It will be a summary all in one place, and that will be made publicly available. It's important to note that the comments that are submitted will be attributed to the individuals and the organizations. And as you'll see in the detailed form that Greta will be going over, there is a component there is a part in the form where that will be included, and it will be communicated and shared within that document that's made publicly available. We will share the link after today's event, the direct link to put you to the part of the website where you will be able to submit your comments, and we look forward to hearing from all of you. Now I'm going to turn it over to Greta to go over the details of the form itself.
Great, thank you, Jess. So like Jess said, I'm just going to walk through this these screenshots to show kind of the technical experience you'll have when you submit your comments. So from the link on the previous page, you should land here. This is in NSF's online workspace. It's where we'll collect and house all those comments and share a lot of the content that we generate from the committee and from this public comment period. So you'll land here on a page, like as you'll see at the top, it's a summary page for a document. So this document linked in the PDF there you can see is the full criteria document. It'll go through all 6 sections that Erica just took you through. And then there's a short description. So in the event that you don't remember my instructions, they should be summarized there and easy to reference. And I also just wanted to point out that that link for the IEEE is there at the bottom too. So you can copy and paste that if you need to reference that document. So once you click into the document, you can download it and review it in depth. But when you're ready to submit comments, you should land back here on this page. And at the top, there's that highlighted section that says add a comment. So it's a little hidden, but it's there. So if you click on that, and then next slide, please. You'll land on this page, and like Jess said, there's multiple fields to collect information. So all required fields have an asterisk there, and that's information you'll be required to submit in order to submit your comment. So just personal information there at the start, to like name and company name. And then the next section is the opportunity to add your comment. So if you can go to the next slide, we can see all those fields. Perfect. So you'll be able to add a subject about your comments, and then there's that comment section. I just want to point out here that it can, don't feel like you have to do this page for every single comment. If you want to batch them based on criteria section, say 4.6.1, you have a lot of comments on, you could add all those here with just notes on what paragraph you'd want to comment on, or language that you'd want to offer up. So feel free to batch those in criteria sections. And then the other thing I want to point out on this page is second to last there's a supporting file option. So that's where you can upload any reference docs you feel are important to the comment that you're making, or things that you want us to review in conjunction with your comments. And then last thing is there's just that slide to save option down there. And then once that's slid, those buttons at the bottom should not be grayed out, and you can save and add another comment if you have more, if you're ready to add more comments to different sections, and then just save if you're finished with commenting. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit. And like I said, all those instructions should be at least shortly summarized in that description page from the link that we'll provide after the webinar. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Jess and Greta. One thing I would actually love to point out is, if you could just go back to that earlier slide. Yeah, so sort of at the the lower third of the page with proposed solution. Really important that you not only provide a comment, but let us know how you would propose resolving your comment. The more specific, the better. But it doesn't, for someone to just say a comment like, we don't like this criteria, or it should be, it shouldn't be here. Well, you need to say why, and give the rationale. But a proposed solution really will help us, basically satisfy your comment if possible. So thank you so much, Greta and Jess. So next slide, please. So before we go into questions and answers, and thanks, I see some coming in, I just want to what are the next steps? So first, a reminder that the public comment process is open for 60 days. It is open until December 6th, and very specifically, comments are due by 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on December 6th. So thereafter, the comment period is over. You'll submit comments via the NSF International online platform. We'll send out, following this call, we will send out the link to the recording to this webinar, but also that email will contain links to the draft criteria, the state of sustainability research, as well as that NSF platform. We do believe that GoToWebinar does not allow you to actually, you can't have a live link, so you'll have to cut and paste it into your browser. So if you have questions, we'd like you to address questions to 2 different email addresses, depending on the nature of your question. So if you have questions on how do I submit the comments, you have questions about the platform, how to work it, etc., those should be directed to Greta. She can help you out with the platform and anything to do with the platform. If you have any questions about the technical content of the climate change criteria or the overall criteria development process, we ask that you send those to criteria@globalelectronicscouncil.org, and they will be handled. I hope this gives you everything you need to submit public comments. I think the next step is we'll start responding to some questions. So let me look to see what's come in here. And I will actually direct it to one of my team members here, or perhaps I'll field some myself as well. So the first question I think for Jess. What is the process for evaluating comments received during the public comment period, and what is the role of the technical committee?
So that's a great question. Thank you, Patty. One that we get often in these projects. So the technical committee will be presented with all of the public comments that are received, and it's NSF's role to compile those and present them to the technical committee in an orderly fashion to work through those and discuss those through our voluntary consensus process. Once we work with the technical committee, NSF will draft responses and summary of action taken to address those comments, and we'll prepare that comment resolution report that will be made publicly available once we've completed the work.
Great, thank you, Jess. And I actually see a follow-up question for you.
Okay.
Will there be a second public comment period before the final criteria are published? I think, there's a little bit of recognition that this is kind of at the beginning of the voluntary consensus process, but of course, it's a very different process because we're starting with a full criteria document that is actually subject to a straw ballot at the same time with the technical committee. So, second public comment period before they're published?
No, there will not be a second public comment period. There's been a significant amount of work, and yes, the voluntary consensus piece of the component of this project is starting, but we are anticipating that collecting these comments over the next 60 days for the full set of criteria will be an excellent exercise as we work to refine the content of the document.
Great, thanks. And Jess, I think you're popular here. And this is actually, there's 2 kind of related questions. One, I think maybe for Jess, one for Greta. So Jess, will the technical committee submit comments in the same way? And that's the first part of the one question. And then is there a way to compile comments offline and attach them so that yeah, so that they can attach them via NSF later, so they could do review and approval within their organization of comments. So that's kind of two pieces to that.
So the first part of the question, so the technical committee will be submitting comments separate from the public comment platform. So it is two separate processes, and the comments will be compiled and considered as a whole for the technical committee to determine action as appropriate. So the second part of the question is, I think I understood this correctly, Patty, is submitting the comments. Will the commenter have the opportunity to go offline to collect feedback from their organization and, let's, as example, put together a spreadsheet to compile everything and then upload it? Yes, that's absolutely an option. I think Greta, in her overview, highlighted the opportunity to upload any reference materials, and so that's how you would go about submitting responses in that manner. But did I understand the question correctly, Patty?
I think you did. And then there's actually a related and maybe even a little more granular question is for Greta. Is there an Excel spreadsheet that I can download to submit my comments?
There is not an existing spreadsheet on the Now. Like Jess said, you could use that supplemental upload, but it'd be best to use the platform, the form that we just went through, to batch upload comments in the comments and proposed section, proposed resolution section. Like I said, as I was going through, I think don't be shy to batch comments together for whole sections. 4.6 or 4.6.1 could go together. Just clarify what paragraph or what criterion specifically that you're commenting on, and that would be the best way.
Great, thanks. Okay, Erica, you're up, I think, here. A question: can a product get the EPEAT label by meeting just the climate change criteria?
Oh, thanks, Patty. That's a great question. And the answer is no. A product will have to meet the required criteria in all 4 of the sustainability impact modules to qualify for EPEAT. So climate change, sustainable use of resources, corporate ESG performance, and chemicals of concern, and potentially some product-specific criteria. That work won't happen until well into next year.
Great. Okay. Let me just, this looks like it's a question for Jess or Greta. When will summarized comments and TC reply be made publicly available? After the TC met and the criteria are finalized, or as the TC discusses it and comes to agreement on each comment?
So we will provide a final report once the work has been completed across the board. So once we've worked through and provided resolution and action for all comments received.
Right.
And the timeline, yeah, the timeline's hard to say. Over the next several months, we will be working. So it's hard to say when exactly that will be made available, but we'll definitely keep in communication on our progress.
Great. And I think there's one last piece to that. I know it was kind of like looks like a 3-part question. I just wanted to, there's a little nuance here that I did want to just raise, and that is it asks whether the or as the TG, I'm sorry, my phone is ringing here. It asks whether as the TC discusses and comes to agreement for each comment. And I think, as I understand the technical committee process as you've described it, and we've discussed it previously, the technical committee is not going to be literally going through the public comment by comment and saying, oh, and here is a response to that comment. Jess, can you just describe the process a little more about, you know, how it's actually done?
Yes, I'm sorry to just go over that. So what will be shared and discussed at the technical committee level is, you know, all comments will be available and shared for review. And what we will be doing is we'll be facilitating the process with the technical committee to look at those comments and consider them for action within the process. So as far as responses and those types of things, that is NSF's role, to put those responses together and get those out to the commenters directly.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Let's see. I think you already answered this one about comments being made publicly available and individual commenters identified. Do you just want to repeat perhaps what you said earlier?
Yeah, great. Another question that we get often. So your comments will be viewed and attributed to your individual, to you individually, as well as your organization. So that final report will include all of that information that is uploaded to the online platform.
Great, thank you. And then it looks like I have a question for you, Erica. There's a lot of good process questions, but we're getting a few content related. So there's a question here, or comment and maybe question. These criteria are very ambitious, particularly the required criteria compared to the existing standards. And why is there, you know, more focus on the supply chain? Shouldn't these criteria be optional, like in existing product standards?
Indeed, great question. So, you know, GEC's State of Sustainability research showed that upstream embodied carbon is a significant portion of a product's carbon footprint in our industry. You know, and while the contribution of upstream embodied carbon varies by product, it was really clear that if we're serious about reducing greenhouse gases, it's really important that EPEAT focus attention on upstream emissions. And so all of these criteria just can't be optional. You know, it used to be the only required criterion in this entire section was Energy Star. And, you know, given the state of sustainability research, that's really just not acceptable. But as mentioned previously, in general, we focused required criteria on where manufacturers have the highest degree of control, i.e. tier 1, directly contracted, and are leveraging the optional criteria to move the market over time to increase that influence further into the supply chain. But thank you for the question.
Great. Okay, let's see. I think I just have one more question here that came in. Okay, when will the result, I don't know who's, let me read this first and then we can decide who's going to answer it. When will the results of the voting in the NSF technical committee and final criteria be published? When the climate change module is completed or when all the modules are completed? That's a good question. So, I mean, you know what, let me take a stab at that, because NSF is actually our partner, but they're GEC criteria. So I think it probably will, though I imagine we could publish them through when NSF actually, posts the public comments, it probably would be appropriate to post that final document, just so people can actually see. So that's what I would actually say would, hadn't really thought about it, but thinking it through now, I think that is actually with the public comments, with the posting of the public comments, it wouldn't make sense to anybody to review the resolution of their comment if they didn't have the document to actually see how it was resolved or what the criteria looked like at the end point. So yes, they will be, the final criteria will be released as they are finalized. And of course, I think that's also very important so that manufacturers have the opportunity they know what the final criteria are going to look like, when they are done. You know what they look like now, right? You'll see the evolution of them and then the final criteria, and the manufacturers can start working on those criteria in the modules as they become complete, and you don't actually have to wait to the end. And so that actually will give manufacturers more time to actually conform to get products ready to go on the EPEAT criteria, EPEAT registry. So I think with that, let me see what else, if I have anything else. Oh, there is one other question, and I think, Jess, this would be for you. And that is, will there be a public comment period when the criteria in the 4 modules are completed and before they are implemented in EPEAT?
So there will not be. So each of the voluntary consensus process for each criteria will be specific to that criteria. So once, and I think that to follow up, Patty, to the question and response, once the climate change process is complete, the resolution report will be made available as well as the final document, the final criteria, and then separately, the next modules will continue. So they will be their individual voluntary consensus process.
Great, thank you. Yes, and that is, we have one other question kind of related, and it is the timeline presented earlier on. And in fact, perhaps we can go to that timeline slide. If you scroll up, I think it was about slide 7 or 8. Oops, the slides went away. Okay, well, let's, I'm sure they'll come back in a second. So the question is about the timeline, and the question is about, I had made a remark about for the climate change criteria, there would be, thank you very much, 2 to 2.5 years after the final criteria are published before hold on, the revised criteria go into effect. Can you repeat the date that the new criteria go into effect? Okay, so here is the slide that I showed previously. And so you can see that in December 2022, we anticipate all 4 modules being complete. So with the launch of the public registry in May of 2023. So for the climate change criteria, which probably have more of the supply chain oriented criteria in them than other of the criteria, with the exception of corporate ESG performance. There would be, from where we sit right now, like 2.5 years before the launch of the public registry. And then the 12-month transition, again, is the transition when we would have up on the EPEAT registry, both the old registry, which old registry is basically the registry based on the current criteria, and then the new registry would be the criteria the modular criteria. And so there'd be a 12-month transition, which the 12-month transition will not change. The only question is, do we hit that May 2023 public launch? But wherever that launch is, it'll be 12 months from then for the transition before the old registry goes away, and only products can be only registered to the new register, or the new conform to the new criteria. So I hope that answers the question, but what it does beg the question of, well, what about the other criteria modules? And so there will be less lead time for the other criteria modules, just by nature of, we are going to be launching we're doing a simultaneous rollout of the sustainability impact modules across the categories when they're all done. So there'll be less lead time for the other modules. So with that, I look like I am frozen in time, at least on my screen here.
But we can hear you just fine, so.
Yeah, let's see. And there's one final question that's come in, and there's a question, it's actually from a technical committee member who has asked about the technical committee and whether there are actually kind of 2 votes in the technical committee. Jess, do you want to just explain that the technical committee, the straw ballot versus, they have to reach consensus right at the end, so that they actually do have 2 votes, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a great question. The straw ballot is an opportunity to collect that initial feedback that will really help drive productive discussions in the coming months. And then the final, once we've worked through all items that have been brought forward for the technical committee's consideration, then there will be a final, approval part of the process in order to ensure that we have met our approval threshold and reached consensus at the technical committee level.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that's actually was a good question.
That's a great question. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for those on the technical committee, and if folks that are not on the technical committee, hear, that, oh, well, there's a second vote. This is, first of all, public comment is not a vote, it's comments, and it's just the technical committee that will actually reach consensus, taking into consideration the input through the public comment process, as well as the input of the technical committee members. So with that, I do not see any other questions that have come in. So I still am frozen on the screen, but let's just close out here. And I just want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar and for all the great questions. Later today, as I mentioned, you'll receive a follow-up email with the links to today's webinar recording. Feel free to share it. The email will also contain links to the NSF online platform, the draft climate change criteria, and the state of sustainability research. And if you, you can also go up on the EPEAT website, and there's an announcements page where you can find these links as well. Should something happen to your this email, know that the EPEAT announcements page always includes the latest on the development of not only the climate change module, but all of the EPEAT sustainability impact modules. So with that, I want to thank Jess and Greta and Erica, Erica has done a wonderful job managing the expert ad hocs, and I know that Jess and Greta are going to do a wonderful job moving forward with the voluntary consensus process technical committee and managing the public comment process. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye now.